Good evening, I'm Jim Lara. On the NewsHour tonight, Margaret Warner follows up on the FBI spy story. Susan Denser and Elizabeth Farnsworth look at the problems bringing AIDS drugs to the poor. Ray Suarez monitors the storm over the rap star called Eminem. And essayist Roger Rosenblatt notes the passing of two special women. It all follows a summary of the news this Wednesday.
Imagine a system that produces and distributes food and helps improve nutrition and health here and abroad. Who is building such a global network?
This program was also made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to PBS stations from viewers like you. Thank you.
There was word today that the crew of the USS Greenville spotted a Japanese fishing boat 71 minutes before ramming and sinking it. The National Transportation Safety Board reported that finding, but a spokesman said a crew member on the American submarine stopped plotting its position less than an hour before the collision February 9th. He said the crewman told investigators civilian guests had distracted him.
The fire control technician of the watch told us that he ceased one of his tasks, updating the CEP, as it's called, which is the contact evaluation plot, which is a manual plot of each contact's bearing and the ship's own course over time, that he ceased one of his tasks, this updating the CEP, because of the number of civilians present.
The safety board official would not say if the halt in the plotting of the submarine's position was in fact a factor in the accident. A spokesman for the Navy said whether civilians distracted the crew will be a matter for a court of inquiry. It's now set to convene on Monday. Also today, U.S. Ambassador Thomas Foley offered personal apologies to the Emperor and Empress of Japan for the accident. He did so at a meeting with them in Tokyo. 9 people from the Japanese boat are missing and presumed dead. The U.S. Supreme Court today limited the scope of the Americans with Disabilities Act. In a 5-4 decision, it said state government workers cannot sue for monetary damages under the 1990 federal law. The majority said the 11th Amendment to the Constitution gives the states immunity from such federal lawsuits. President Bush today proposed an extra $1.6 billion for elementary and secondary education. It's within his plan to increase next year's Education Department budget by 11%, more than any other cabinet agency. And he called again for testing to make sure students learn the basics. He spoke at a school near Knoxville, Tennessee.
I think it's so important for us to prioritize public education. At the same time, we prioritize making a priority of making sure our money is spent well. A priority has got to be diligence when it comes to taxpayers' money. And that's why I'm confident the combination of an increase in spending coupled with education reform that holds people accountable is the right path for America to take.
Mr. Bush will submit his 2002 budget to Congress next week. The Pfizer company will offer an AIDS-related drug free of charge in South Africa. The U.S. pharmaceutical firm made that announcement today. The drug treats a throat infection and a form of meningitis common in AIDS patients. The free distribution program is expected to cost Pfizer more than $48 million over 2 years. We'll have more on AIDS drugs in the developing world later in the program tonight. Pope John Paul II installed 44 new Roman Catholic cardinals today. It was a record number. The ceremony took place in St. Peter's Square at the Vatican. The new cardinals represented 27 countries, 5 continents. Among those installed were several Americans, theologian Avery Dulles of Fordham University, and Archbishops Edward Egan of New York and Theodore McCarrick of Washington, D.C. There are now 184 cardinals. 135 are younger than 80 and therefore eligible to vote. for the next pope. John Paul has named all but 10 of those. Back in this country today, there was inflation news from the Labor Department. It reported the Consumer Price Index rose 0.6% last month, the most in 10 months. A record rise in natural gas prices was the main factor. The news caused concern on Wall Street. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 204 points to 10,526, down nearly 2%, and the NASDAQ index had its lowest finish in nearly 2 years. It lost 49 points to close at 2268, down more than 2%. And that's it for the news summary tonight. Now it's on to more on the FBI spy investigation, treating AIDS among the poor, a rap music storm, and a Roger Rosenblatt essay. Margaret Warner has the FBI story.
For 15 years, FBI counterintelligence specialist Robert Hanssen eluded suspicion while selling U.S. secrets to the Soviet Union and Russia. For more on how the alleged spy plied his trade and how he was ultimately caught, we turn to 3 experts in spycraft. James Woolsey was CIA director in the early 1990s when CIA agent Aldrich Ames was arrested for spying. David Wise has written widely about espionage. His latest book is Cassidy's Run, The Secret Spy War Over Nerve Gas. And Robert Heibel was the FBI's deputy chief of counterterrorism in the mid-1980s when Hanssen allegedly began spying for the Soviets. Welcome, gentlemen. Jim Woolsey, beginning with you. We've had a chance to read this 100-page affidavit, and there are all of these letters in particular that Hanssen allegedly wrote to the Soviets, and they wrote back to him. What is the picture that emerges about his motivation? I mean, did he fit the typical profile?
Very strange. During the Cold War, the U.S. and the West really mainly lost agents, had spies recruited by the Soviets for money. It wasn't like the 30s and during World War II when there were a number of ideological agents, Hiss and others who worked for the Soviets on the basis of some kind of ideological commitment. This seems to be a sort of a strange in-between case. He took money. He seems motivated in part from what he writes by pride and arrogance in a sense. But he also says at one point that he decided to do this when he was 14 years old. He talks favorably about Philby, even suggests he read the Philby book early, the British spy who spied for the Soviets. It's a strange potpourri of motivations. It's a little hard to pin him down.
What jumped out at you, David Wise?
$1,400,000, which the FBI says he was paid or was held in an escrow account in Moscow.
Yet he indicates in the letters he only got $600,000 actually,
Yeah.
and that he didn't really believe that $800,000 was really there. A couple letters he says, "Oh, we know that that's an accounting term."
Take the money and run. Well, that's for one reason. He thinks that diamonds are a spy's best friend, according to the charges of the FBI, and there were diamonds involved as well. But you know, I would agree that with Jim Woolsey that the motives may have been a little bit mixed, for example, but I think the money is primary. But aside from that, he does talk in some of the correspondence with the Russians, according to the documents that have been released, about the thrill of the work. So I think he's a man who liked the idea of living on the edge, the James Bond syndrome. And I think that was the case of some other recent spies. I think it was true of Harold James Nicholson, for example.
James Bond working for Goldfinger.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Robert Heibel, what jumped out at you? One thing I wanted to ask you about was he does express some disdain for his fellow FBI colleagues, but there doesn't seem to be a great hatred for the United States or hatred for the system in these letters.
It may very well be a feeling that he has about the FBI. What jumps out at me about him is his ability to take the training that he's received in the FBI and be able to turn it on the FBI so that he can avoid detection. And it's very similar to having someone in the NewsHour who was working for another network, your competition, and being able to provide information on what your news plans are, what your 5-year agenda is, profile of people in your organization. He was really a fox in a hen house, only he was in hen's clothing.
Now, you actually served in the New York field office, not exactly when he did, but Did you know him?
No, I did not know him.
All right, Jim Woolsey, let's talk about how he dealt now with his handlers, because as you pointed out, or indirectly you did, he wasn't recruited, he volunteered.
He volunteered. According to the affidavit, they did not know, the Soviets, the Russians did not know who he was until he was caught. He was very professional. He did this for a living. He was a counterintelligence officer, so he knew the things to avoid. He didn't travel overseas to meet them. He wouldn't even meet them face to face in this country. Used entirely dead drops and very clever spycraft. Anyone who's interested in tradecraft ought to read this affidavit. It's very interesting.
Did it strike you as plausible, though, that the Soviets wouldn't have wanted to know who he is? Couldn't they have just skulked back and taken a photograph of him when he came to pick up the money?
They tried to get him to meet with them and meet overseas, and he kept rejecting it. They could have, I suppose, have done that, but if he detected them, he might have stopped working for them, and furthermore, they might have been detected by some kind of counter-surveillance. So they were willing, because his initial offering was so devastating. Two American agents, Soviets, lost their lives in part because of him and Ames, and a third was arrested and eventually released. His initial offering was so devastatingly effective that they knew they had something useful here, and so they humored him and did it the way he wanted.
No, I think you have to ask, well, why didn't he want his identity known? And I think the answer to that is that every spy lives in horror that a defector will come out from the other side and identify that spy. And so if they knew his identity and what agency he worked for, it would be a lot easier to pinpoint who he was.
And he really laid down these ground rules in that very first letter, didn't he?
He was in control, yes.
Bob
He
Heibel,
also-
what would you add to that?
I would add to that he knew at this time that the Bureau was having success recruiting people within the Soviet establishments. And I'm sure that he knew what the problems would be and how the Bureau would react. And he was able to take advantage of his tradecraft, as Jim said. And very, very shrewd operation.
But what about, David Weiss, what about this sort of psychological profile? As I read some of these letters, by the end, he sounded kind of needy. He would say, well, you've ignored me, and I've been loyal to you, and I hate silence.
If we could take the Aldrich Ames case as an example, Ames said flat out, I changed sides. And once he had made that decision to be loyal to another country, then psychologically, what they felt about him was important, and the care and feeding of Aldrich Ames became very important to him because perhaps he didn't feel that the CIA was giving him the kind of recognition that he felt he deserved, but he looked to the Russians to give him that, and I think if these charges are correct, there could be something of the same nature here.
So why, go ahead, Mr. Heibel, you were trying to get in.
I was just going to say that in the case of Aldrich Ames, he had face-to-face contacts with the Soviets. In this case, Hansen was working completely alone and isolated. There was no one he could talk to about this situation, which, in view of his apparent ego, must have been very, very frustrating for him.
So, Jim Woolsey, the question is, and you've all described how he used the skills of his trade, but still, why was he never detected? When Aldrich Ames was arrested in '94, I gather you all in the intelligence community felt there probably still could well be another mole in the intelligence community.
There was always such a suspicion that it was a possibility, and this is one of the things it looks like that may have borne that out. Ames, much of what was wrong with the CIA that let Ames spy so effectively for 9 years was that things had been so decentralized in the aftermath of James Angleton holding everything together centrally until the mid-'70s. All the CIA functions were decentralized, so the people who knew about Ames's drinking didn't know about his security violation, and those people didn't know about his house being bought for cash and so forth. One of the things we did right after that was pull things together more. It doesn't look like that was the problem here. It doesn't look like he did anything to give himself away. At least there's nothing in the affidavit that would suggest that.
So, but Mr. Heibel, what about at the FBI? Do they? I've read that they don't give random polygraphs. But here was a guy who wasn't looking into bank robberies. I mean, his expertise was counterintelligence and dealing with the Russians and Soviets. Is there just no kind of spot checking of, say, his computer traffic when he's checking his own name through the system, or any of these little signs that it looks like maybe there were?
If I were an FBI supervisor handling foreign counterintelligence, and I had a young man like this come on my squad, I'd be ecstatic. He studied Russian in college. He was conscientious, had a family man, no apparent weaknesses. He was very much interested in computers and technology. He would have been an ideal candidate for foreign counterintelligence squad. As far as detecting irregularities, a supervisor would look for the traditional, the money problems, the family problems, a womanizer. But this man just did not show those traits. And he didn't show those traits because he knew those traits were traits that would give him away.
So David Wise, he's finally caught only because somehow the authorities come in possession of this treasure trove, this whole dossier, ostensibly from a Russian source. Is that what it looks like to you?
Well, that's what the FBI is saying, what Director Free said yesterday, that they got some very, very important assistance from a source, which, of course, is the last thing that they're prepared to reveal right now. It is important to note that, according to the affidavit, some of the correspondence with the KGB and its successor agency was found in his computer on the disks that the FBI found. And but a lot of the material apparently would have had to come from a Russian source. I would suspect a defector, but that's only speculation.
So is the unfortunate or the unpleasant lesson of this, though, Jim Woolsey, that unless you've got, I mean, if they'd never gotten this source, all these documents, he'd still be out there doing what he was doing?
Well, we don't know how they got it. Let's hope they stole it. I think that would be wonderful if they stole it from some Russian. If they did, or however they did it, it's been a very effective way to catch this fellow. But you have to have some kind of break. You have to have a defector or something like that if someone's being as careful as this fellow was. There's one other point, Margaret. There are tens of thousands of retired FBI agents and people out there now, and I know how badly we felt out at the CIA when Ames was caught, and I think it's important to say that this should not tar the reputation of the FBI. It is a fine institution. They do a phenomenal job, and this is every organization, including the CIA and the FBI, is going to have somebody like this come along once in a while, and he shouldn't be considered by anyone as emblematic of the Bureau.
All right.
Margaret?
Just very briefly, we're actually out of time, but yes.
One observation on this is that the success that the FBI had, once they had the information identified him, and being able to actually go out and successfully operate against him, in spite of all his skills, is a real compliment to the FBI staff, particularly the young agents that operate in the Washington Field Army.
All right.
And maybe to other agencies.
Gentlemen, we have to leave it there, but thank you all three very much.
Still to come on the NewsHour tonight, treating AIDS in the underdeveloped world, the M&M controversy, and a Roger Rosenblatt essay. AIDS, drugs, and the world's poor. Susan Dentzer of our health unit begins. The unit's a partnership with the Henry J. Kaiser Family Foundation.
An estimated 36 million people worldwide are infected with HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. In recent years, new antiviral drugs have prolonged lives and slashed death rates of AIDS sufferers in many Western countries. But prices for these medications can range from $10,000 to $15,000 a year for combinations of drugs called cocktails. That puts them out of reach of much of the developing world, where AIDS has hit hardest. Deborah Work-Zudi is the World Bank's top official monitoring the AIDS pandemic.
The health expenditure for most of these countries is $12 per year per person. To expect these countries to provide the resources for antiretroviral drugs will not be realistic.
As a result, in sub-Saharan Africa, where an estimated 24 million are infected with HIV, fewer than 1 in 1,000 are getting the advanced drug therapy. That means that having AIDS there is a sentence to die a long, slow, painful death. At the core of the problem is the fact that, like many drugs, antiviral medications are protected by patents. Under a global agreement, most countries now award such patent protection for 20 years. That means drug manufacturers have a number of years to set prices where they want, to recoup development costs and earn profits. Last year, 5 major pharmaceutical companies that hold patents on antiviral drugs agreed to sell them at discounts to countries hit hard by AIDS. But so far, only 3 countries, Senegal, Uganda, and Rwanda, have negotiated arrangements with the manufacturers. They'd reportedly obtain drugs at a discounted price of about $1,000 per person per year.
One thing that works for Senegal is the prevalence rate is still very low. It's still around 1%, and the people that require antiretroviral drugs are very few in number. But if you take countries that are hit hardest by this epidemic, where the prevalence rate is 10%, 20%, even at $1,000 per person per year, these are costs that most of these countries will never be able to support.
As a result, some countries and companies have tried to chip away at patent protections to get drugs to millions in need. Recently, Cipla Limited, a drug company based in India, offered to produce a combination of antiviral drugs that are close copies of patented products. It said it would sell those drugs to the international assistance group Doctors Without Borders for just $350 per patient per year. Cipla has offered to pay the companies that hold patents to the drugs a small royalty, equal to 5% of sales, for a license to produce them. At least 2 companies are reportedly contemplating Cipla's offer. Brazil, where an estimated 500,000 people are infected with HIV, has taken a different tack. In 1998, the government began making copies of antiviral drugs under a law that declared patents issued before May 1997 null and void in Brazil. Now it's also threatening to produce at least 2 other antiviral drugs patented after 1997. With the patent holders and the U.S. Trade Representative fighting the plan, the dispute is now headed for the World Trade Organization. International officials like Zudi are calling for unprecedented efforts to get antiviral drugs and other treatments to the hardest hit countries.
I think this is almost a defining moment in history where each entity in this game has to come together and give in and compromise.
If not, these officials say, the costs of battling the pandemic will only balloon as the death toll and infection rates continue to rise in much of the world.
Elizabeth Farnsworth in San Francisco has more.
And we turn now to Joël Tanguy, the U.S. Executive Director of the organization Doctors Without Borders, a leader in the campaign for cheaper AIDS drugs. Jeffrey Sachs, a professor at Harvard University and chairman of the World Health Organization's Commission on Macroeconomics and Health. Dr. Gladine Machali, South Africa's health representative to the U.S., Canada, and Brazil, and Shannon Hersfeld, Senior Vice President of International Affairs for PhRMA, an association representing American drug makers. Joël Tanguy, do you agree with what Ms. Zawudi said, the World Bank representative we just heard, that, quote, we're in almost a defining moment in history in our dealing with worldwide AIDS? And if so, why?
Yeah, I would actually agree. I think what's happening here is that we used to be a couple of years ago simply, we do field work in Africa, in Latin America, and Asia, totally frustrated doctors, really witness to the patients not being even able to contemplate treatment for AIDS, for opportunistic diseases of AIDS, as well as a number of other infectious disease conditions. Now we're looking at a situation where the issue is finally being understood as a global issue, not just an African issue, not just a Latin American issue, and to a global issue is required a global response. And the second point is this, beyond a lot of the announcements that have happened in recent years, I think we're getting close now to having the first stumbling block removed along the way of treating AIDS patients, the price, and we can move on and address some of the other issues.
Dr. Machali, do you agree with that? And how important for South Africa is today's announcement about the free drug from Pfizer?
For South Africa, it's very important. I think you may be aware that South Africa has attempted doing what Brazil is doing at present, and for which it's highly commended. We had passed legislation in '97 already that would have allowed South Africa to import cheaper drugs or to produce its own generic versions, but unfortunately we were taken to court by 40 pharmaceutical companies, and we will be in court about that in the next 2 weeks. But it is critical for us. We also understand that we must have the necessary infrastructure in order to make sure that those drugs are appropriately given, taken, and monitored.
And Jeffrey Sachs, you've said that the current situation is a catch-22 situation. What do you mean?
Well, the problem is that a number of forces have to come together to make a solution, but I think it's about to happen, actually. What the drug companies have done recently is said, yes, we'll cut the price sharply, and as your story indicated, 3 countries have already negotiated significant discounts. But nothing's happened since then because those countries are too poor to buy the drugs even at a very deep discount. There's one player that has not come forward yet, but I think will, and that's the U.S. government and counterparts among the rich countries in Europe and Japan. Unless the rich countries put up the money to buy these drugs at the discounted prices and provide them essentially for free in the impoverished countries in Africa, nothing will happen. But if the donor countries now come forward and say, yes, the prices are low enough that we're actually able to foresee a large-scale effort at treatment, then I think the pieces will quickly come into play.
And Shannon Hirschfeld, before we go on briefly, what's your view of the current moment? How do the drug companies see it? Is this really the turning point?
Well, I think we are firmly committed to make sure that our life-saving therapies get to patients, not only in the U.S. and Western Europe, but into all countries, even the poorest of countries. And in fact, we've been working hard for that goal. We discover and we develop medicines, life-saving therapies, but we can't get them to patients in a safe and effective way alone. We need partners. We need developing country partners. We need non-government organizations. And as Dr. Sachs has noted, we also need the developed world to continue to take notice because the burden is great.
Okay, we'll come back to solutions in a second, but I want to get specific now. Joël Tanguy, explain the CIPLA offer to your organization and what difference it would make in a specific program in sub-Saharan Africa, for example.
The CIPLA, the Indian generic manufacturer CIPLA, made an offer to which we're responding at the moment by trying to extend it to all other organizations, governmental and non-governmental, UN agencies and so on, involved in the treatment of patients in the world, AIDS patients. And what we're trying to say is that what you're saying is you can produce for $350. That's great. We actually believe that. We believe that competition can even drop the price further down, possibly to $200. Let's make sure that this is made available to those who need it. And let's make sure that we can understand that the generic manufacturers, just as the way that they have dropped the price in vaccines to such an extent that you can vaccinate in Africa for measles now, whereas you could not at the beginning of the introduction of the drugs, then it's the same thing here, that we have to really engage generic manufacturers as well. And not necessarily CIPLA, but a number of other initiatives, very successful initiatives in Brazil, which have demonstrated that, generic competition can drop the price, and when it's accompanied by a political will, a real commitment to address the crisis, then it really can have incredible effects, such as a drop of mortality and morbidity of 50% and some major savings in public health support.
Shannon Hirschfeld, what is the view of your member companies of this offer?
Well, I think CIPLA has garnered quite a bit of attention in these past few weeks by making their offer, but we all need to realize that CIPLA is a very old Indian company who has made their business out of copying products that were invented in America and Western Europe, and they make a wide variety of products from muscle relaxants to moisturizers, and now they're getting into the antiretroviral business. I think the more important thing is to look at India. India has no patent.
But what is your view of their offer?
I think it is a distraction. I think we need to realize that every day in India, 3,500 people become HIV positive, and the World Bank says by 2005 there'll be 35 million
people in India who are HIV positive. CIPLA is not a research company. The cures that are going to come to those Indians are going to come from our industry, and that's where the resources ought to be directed.
It's been reported that some of your companies are thinking of licensing the drug to CIPLA. Is that not true?
I think any individual company is allowed to go into a license disagree or discussion with any company anywhere in the world. I don't have information. But I think we need to once again remember that long term, 24 million people in Africa, perhaps 35 million people in India are going to need simpler therapies, preventative vaccines, and eventually a cure. And that's going to come from the research-based industry.
Dr. Michalli, what's your response to that, and what does this mean for South Africa, the possible ability to get much cheaper drugs through somebody like CIPLA?
I really think that that is one of the initiatives that one need to watch very carefully. I think Brazil has already shown that with the generic substitution, there is leverage in that it forces down the prices of drugs. It's shown that there's an article that we read recently that shows that without a competitive drug that, for example, Brazil produces, prices over a 4-year period may drop by about 9%, but when there is a generic equivalent, it can easily drop by about 79–80%, which is what I think we need to work towards. If there is an understanding that competition drives down prices, then there is a role for generic drug manufacturers. And we certainly want to look at that example that is in Brazil and that is elsewhere. South Africa looks at sustainable solutions, and that is why when we talk about offers, drug offers, we want to make sure that it is paired with, for example, the initiative that Pfizer has undertaken, which is to also contribute towards infrastructure building, because it doesn't help to just drop drugs into a country and then not be able to sustain the introduction of it.
I actually wanted to ask you about that very briefly. The question is always raised whether a country like South Africa can distribute and provide these drugs safely with follow-up and the necessary testing.
We have a certain level of infrastructure, but we certainly would need a lot more resources from the developed countries, from partners such as the pharmaceutical companies. And I do think that we need to keep the partnership open. We do need the research and development pharmaceuticals as well as generic manufacturers. But we need to be willing to look at what countries are doing in order to build on existing infrastructure.
All right, Jeffrey Sachs, put this in perspective for us, and while you're doing it, lay out what you'd like to have happen, which is, you mentioned it before, U.S. government help getting these drugs to poor people in other countries.
Thank you. I think it has to be understood that Brazil has an average income per year of about $3,000 per person, but most of sub-Saharan Africa has an average income of roughly $300 per person. They can't afford the drugs even at the highly discounted prices. So I think the issue of generics or major pharmaceuticals is not really the point. The major pharmaceuticals are ready to drop the prices substantially. We ought to take that offer and protect their intellectual property rights at the same time so they have the incentives to continue to innovate. But with the discounted prices, we need to get the drugs to the poorest people in the poorest countries. And that's going to cost money that's going to have to come from the rich countries. It's really time right now for the United States and Europe to step up and put what for us is very modest amounts, but for Africa would be life-saving amounts of millions of people per year's lives saved, of a few $billion to be able to purchase the drugs at discount and then get them safely and effectively to the people that need them. It has to be said also, these are not easy medications to use. If there isn't high adherence by the patients, then there's a risk of rapid development of drug resistance. So there has to be a lot of scaling up of capacity, a lot of training, and a lot of new methods, some of which are being explored by my own colleagues at Harvard, for example, who've been successfully treating very poor people in Haiti using directly observed treatment where you watch the patients take the drugs to make sure that the adherence rates are high. All of this is to say that we need an international effort of partnership where the major pharmaceutical companies do what they've said they'll do, drop the prices, where we respect their property rights, where the rich countries put up some of the resources, and where the poor countries commit to make their meager resources but vital resources available for well thought out strategies. and where our major scientific centers like the National Institutes of Health help to ensure that these complex drugs and protocols are used effectively to really save lives. If we do all of that, millions of people can be saved. Thank you.
Joelle Tanguy, we have fairly limited time left, and I want all the rest of you to comment on that and say what you think really must be done right away.
I agree with Jeffrey Sachs that the political commitment, the collective engagement into subsidizing some of the poorer countries, the ones who anyway, even at $200, which is the price where it's not yet, but hopefully we need to drive it at, will not be able to access the medicine. We need to subsidize that total. We need now to make that political commitment. However, the devil is in the details in the proposal. We have to make sure that what we provide is really converging towards what we're trying to do, which is not protect a trade agreement, but fundamentally respond to a public health crisis and make sure that everything we do does respond to that. Further competition in order to respond to that crisis, supporting the governments that want to take the crisis head on, address it with local production. That would be good. That would be effective in some countries. So it's an either-or situation, but it's definitely a frontal commitment for both subsidies and engagement.
Shannon Hirschfeld, what's your view of what needs to be done now, briefly?
We need structures in place to assure that when our medicines go into a country, they actually get to the patients to which they're intended. Right now, 88% of all pharmaceuticals going into sub-Saharan Africa still don't reach the proper patient. And until that's fixed, we end up possibly doing more harm than good, particularly with difficult therapies like HIV/AIDS and tuberculosis.
And Dr. Micali, what do you see in the near future that must be done?
We need to continue working on these partnerships. We need to make sure if we make offers to any country that it should not preclude other options that are available, for example, the local manufacturing of drugs. And of course, we need to make sure that we work on a vaccine and that we also improve the prevention components so that people in the first place do not get infected.
Thank you all very much.
Now a loud flap over a rap star, and to Ray Suarez.
Eminem's music is a worldwide hit. His recording, the Marshall Mathers LP, has sold 10 million copies. But the mainstream, pop-dominated Grammy Awards isn't having an easy time celebrating Eminem's commercial success. The 28-year-old rapper from Detroit, whose real name is Marshall Mathers, has been nominated for 4 Grammys, including the coveted Album of the Year. But Eminem has come under fire for his violent, disturbing lyrics and videos. He, or his alter ego Slim Shady, fantasizes in songs about killing his wife and raping his mother, and some songs have been called anti-gay because he calls homosexuals sick and worse and makes jokes about killing them. At a Senate hearing last year on violence in the entertainment industry, former head of the National Endowment for Humanities, Lynn Cheney, wife of Vice President Dick Cheney, had harsh words for Eminem's lyrics.
They could not be more despicable. They could not be more hateful in their attitudes toward women in particular. There are many groups that Eminem is quite despicable toward, but he is a violent misogynist. He advocates raping and murdering his mother in one of his songs. He glories in the same song in the idea that he might murder any woman he comes across.
Put your hands down, I ain't gonna shoot you. But the CDs keep on selling. His Marshall Mathers LP was the second best-selling album last year behind boy band NSYNC, beating out pop idol Britney Spears. The rap superstar says his lyrics shouldn't be taken seriously.
The kids aren't taking my music. They're taking my music for what it's worth. Do you know what I mean? They're taking it with a grain of salt. They don't. It's not the kids that are bugging out.
Sir, what is your name?
Marshall Mathers.
Even offstage, Eminem has run into trouble. Last week, he appeared before a Michigan judge and pleaded guilty to a charge of carrying a concealed weapon. Despite the outrage of many activists, Elton John, who's gay, has agreed to take the stage with Eminem during the Grammys tonight to perform one of Eminem's songs, Stand. John told the LA Times, quote, "I think there's far more humor on the album than people think. I honestly don't think people will go out and start beating and killing people because of this album." Hundreds of demonstrators are expected to protest the awards ceremony tonight in Los Angeles. For more on Eminem, we're joined by Nelson George, a cultural writer and the author of several books about the music industry, including Hip Hop America, and Oliver Wang, a music critic for several publications, including The Source, a magazine covering the rap industry. Oliver Wang, help us understand what's behind Marshall Mathers as a top-selling artist. Is it the bad boy image? Is it the music?
I think it's a lot of those elements put together. I think the fact that he was able to both bridge the gap between being appealing to black listeners on one hand, but also really reach sort of the key market among white teenagers. All those things came together to sort of propel him to the kind of pop star that he is.
And describe for me your experience sitting and listening to the 70-plus minutes of the Marshall Mathers LP.
You know, my first impression is I really felt that it was very similar to his last album. I didn't really find it to be that creative or innovative compared to what he put out on his first LP, the Slim Shady LP. And moreover, he spends about half the album really sort of whining about how he's a victim and how he's castigated by critics. And just from a compelling point of view, it's not that imaginative, it's not that interesting to listen to someone complain, about how big of a star he is, but the sort of the cost of it. The way that he does it, to me, doesn't suggest anything that I find particularly interesting. I didn't think it was a bad album, musically speaking, but I didn't find it that compelling, and the content problems with it, really made me much more questionable about it.
Whiny, not compelling, but is it offensive?
I do think it's offensive. I think that what he describes on his album is sort of a combination of both ignorance and arrogance, which I would find frightening from any pop artist or any public official for that matter.
Nelson George, what should people who are just hearing about Marshall Mathers during this run-up to the Grammy Awards understand about this man and the music he makes?
Well, he's probably one of the funniest MCs ever to come down the pike. He's a very fine wordsmith. He puts phrases together very well. He's a very compelling storyteller. And backed by Dr. Dre, who's probably the preeminent hip-hop producer of the last 15 years, and arguably one of those preeminent pop music producers of the last decade. It's a fine piece of pop music. It's the question of is he offensive or not is an interesting one, in that I find him very humorous. I'm the guy who sat in the back row at Hannibal and laughed, however. And I think a lot of the people, there's a definite generational split or an aesthetic split in how he's perceived. If you find him humorous, you see that he's pushing the envelope on incest, on rape. He's taking topics that are not inherently funny and trying to find humor in them in a very deadpan way. Then if you laugh at that, if you go along with that, then you're in on a joke. If you don't feel he's funny, if you don't feel that he's a witty writer, then you're totally like, this is the most offensive thing ever. So it's definitely an aesthetic battle that's going on around the music.
Oliver Wang, just a generational problem?
I think that's part of it, though. But I think that there's satire on one hand, and I think there's a line that you can cross between satire and sadism to a certain degree. And I do think that he's a very witty lyricist in some ways. But I'm kind of curious, and maybe I can ask this of Nelson, that if he had replaced every reference in his songs as sort of brutalizing gays in the queer community, and women for that matter, with references and racial slurs to African Americans, to what degree would Eminem have sort of have all these defenders and apologists out there? I think that, less disturbing than Eminem to me is not so much the messenger, but the message that he's putting out. And the fact that so many people, including critics, as well as the 7-8 million people who've bought his album, don't bat an eye at what he's saying, I think that's very perturbing in some way. What does that say about what kind of values he's espousing and how that's accepted within America?
Nelson George?
Well, I think that one thing hip-hop is very proven is that everyone can be offended at any point in time. I mean, 10 years ago, NWA was saying exactly some of the same things about black people that Eminem has said about gays, causing an equivalent uproar. Hip-hop exists, at least this aspect of hip-hop, the harder core of it. Part of its reason for existing at all is to be offensive, is to challenge our social norms, and to raise the hackles in the back of our neck. That doesn't mean that I agree with everything in Eminem or I agree with everything with NWA. However, I think that what they're expressing are the unspoken things that are going on in this country. Eminem speaks for, to some degree, a community of males, particularly young teenage males, white males for that matter, who have a rage, who feel alienated from the kinds of comforts of the last 10 years of the economy doing well. There's a sort of a white trash, black trash, if you will, or urban world that's not spoken for, that's not seen in pop culture. And for better or worse, Eminem speaks for them, gives them voice. And some of the things he says in doing so are offensive to people. But it doesn't necessarily mean they're invalid.
Well, has the line moved? Has what's acceptable changed? Because the old story that adults would be upset and wringing their hands over what young adults are listening to, there's nothing new in that, but there's a big difference between not shooting Elvis Presley below the waist on television and putting Marshall Mathers on.
Well, it's about the respect for the audience, ultimately. One of the other Grammy-nominated albums for Album of the Year is Two Against Nature by Steely Dan, made by two fine 50-year-old musicians. And in that album, there's songs about incest, there's songs about having, which border on pedophilia. But because these guys are established artists, they're 50, the audience is baby boomers, they take it for granted that their audience will understand that this is a sort of joke or a character playing role playing. When Marshall Mathers becomes Eminem, becomes Slim Shady, and uses multiple personalities, no one says, well, this is a very clever use of literary devices. This is a very clever way to try and be a storyteller. It's assumed that he means everything he's saying, and that the audience will assume that they're going to do everything he says. And I think that's a way of condescending to the contemporary youth audience, which is that's very offensive to me.
Oliver Wang, are there double standards in play? The Dixie Chicks had a hit song about killing an abusive husband. Sean Colvin sang about burning her house down with her husband in it. Why is Marshall Mathers getting all the attention?
Well, I think you're sort of comparing apples and oranges in those two cases. And I'm sort of aware of the controversy around the Steely Dan nomination. And if Steely Dan had spent half their album, or more, sort of encouraging pedophilia,
well,
I think that they
spent more than half their career doing that. I mean, they've been making songs like Hey 19, for example, that goes back to previous albums. It's not like Steely Dan is a group that has not walked the line and has not dealt with very aggressive and sometimes dark issues in their albums. But they are perceived as being adult music makers who would know better, and Eminem is not. And I think there is a double standard very much at work.
Oliver Wang?
Well, again, I think that the issue with Eminem specifically is that there is definitely a line of satire that he takes. There is humor in his music, and to a certain extent you could write off as he's joking. But I mean, to me personally, just listening to the album, I mean, there's a lot on there that to me does not seem like humor, that actually seems to speak to a certain pathology within Eminem in terms of his mistrust of the queer community, his mistrust and violence towards women. And to me, I'm not advocating censorship by any means, but I do think that there is a valid room for public criticism against what he's doing and the album itself.
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. I think that what he's done is put a lot of things on the table. I mean, here's the thing. Why is Eminem popular? There's several reasons. One is his wordsmith, his craftsmanship as an MC. Part of it is the music production of Dr. Dre and others. And part of it is that there are levels of his message which are resonating with an audience. Now, we may not agree with that the messages that are being presented, but it says something about the mentality that's around this country, especially among young men, that he speaks to. And I think that that's the issue. The issue is not Eminem per se. The issue is what he represents and what attitudes he's bringing to light. So both in a humorous way and sometimes in a very explicit way, he's talking about the unease that a lot of young men have about their sexual identity. The unease some men have about dealing with homosexuals. And I think that that's a valid thing to be discussing in American culture right
Oliver
now.
Wang, go ahead.
Century.
Well, I'm not sure if he's discussing or advocating a certain line of action. I will say this much. Again, I think that the focus should be less on Eminem as an artist and more in terms of how whatever he's saying in his album is disseminating. And to me, what I find perturbing about all of the support that has been made publicly, like especially in the last few days around Eminem, is that it reflects to me a value in which in America violence against gays, violence against women is not simply accepted, but in some ways sanctioned in terms of if you look at propositions and legislation. And that what Eminem is speaking to his 8 million fans and to these rock critics is an acceptable line of sort of rhetoric, which is that it's okay to make jokes about bashing and killing gays, about killing women and maiming women, because to some degree domestic violence and homophobia are things that are acceptable values. Again, if Eminem had made an album where he was slurring African Americans or slurring Jews, this situation would be quite different. Even if he was doing it with the same sort of humor that people are talking about, I think he would be run out of town instantly.
I think that hip-hop has had a tradition, an unfortunate tradition in my view, of in fact slurring and attacking African Americans and being involved in sometimes almost genocidal type of rhetoric. So it's not a new thing. What Eminem is doing is taking I'm not saying that, again, I'm not saying that...
Gentlemen, we're going to leave it there. Nelson George, Oliver Wang, thank you both.
Thank you.
Finally tonight, essayist Roger Rosenblatt pays tribute to two women who died recently.
Even the places they died in were opposites. Anne Morrow Lindbergh died at the age of 94 at her home in wintry Passumpsic, Vermont. On the same day, Dale Evans died at age 88 at her home in Apple Valley, California. Until she met and married Roy Rogers, Evans knocked around as a $12 a week stenographer and bit player in westerns. When Anne Morrow met Charles A. Lindbergh, she was on vacation from Smith College, visiting her parents in Mexico City. Her father, a multi-millionaire partner in J.P. Morgan, was ambassador to Mexico. Her mother, an author, once served as Smith's acting president. The differences between the two women were more pronounced than that, but their similar circumstances shaped the feminists they became, feminists in a pre-feminist age. Both experienced tragedies with their children. Lindbergh suffered through the world-shaking kidnapping and murder of her 20-month-old son, Charles Jr. Evans's daughter, Robin, died of Down syndrome shortly before her second birthday. Two of the Rogers' adopted children died also. A 12-year-old girl was the victim of a church bus collision, and an 18-year-old, a private in the Army, choked to death in a military hospital in Germany. Both women were creative and successful. Lindbergh wrote over 24 books of poetry and prose, including the best-selling Gift from the Sea, which, over 20 years, sold 5 million copies.
Happy trails to you until...
Evans composed over 24 songs, among them Aha San Antone, which sold over 200,000 copies, The Bible Tells Me So, and Happy Trails, the theme song of The Roy Rogers Show, on which she starred with her husband, often playing third fiddle to the horse Trigger. And both tended toward conservative politics, though of different stripes. In the 1960s, Evans joins a group of actors who urged a constitutional amendment permitting school prayer. And Lindbergh was publicly supportive of her husband's pro-Hitler and isolationist views in the pre-war years. She later admitted that she had been naive and misled, but the taint of anti-Semitism remained with the two of them their whole lives. But the deeper connection of these women is that both owed their fame to their marriages, and yet each possessed attitudes and gifts that justify their individual prominence. One was married to the most famous man in the world, the other to the king of the cowboys. In a sense, both were sidekicks, and the world initially saw them that way. Yet each was not only separately talented, but also driven by the desire to show that women, even those bound to other glittery lives, had complex lives of their own, and nerve, and spirit. "I hate namby-pamby heroines," said Evans in praise of a part she was playing that was, quote, "a pleasant departure from the usual Western role in which the girl stands around while the men do violent and admirable things." "What a circus act we perform every day of our lives," wrote Lindbergh. "Look at us. We run a tightrope daily, balancing a pile of books on the head, baby carriage, parasol, kitchen chair. This is not the life of simplicity, but the life of multiplicity that the wise men warn us of. It leads not to unification, but to fragmentation. It does not bring grace. It destroys the soul." Lindbergh's observation remains alive to generations long past hers. Evans, less literary, was characterized by similar strains of thought. The women never met, East and West never met, but they probably would have got along. Both had what one used to call moxie. Both were superior to the shadows they walked in. And both were joined by a feeling of insistence that women, including those married to kings, were worth just as much. I'm Roger Rosenblatt.
Again, the major stories of this Wednesday. The National Transportation Safety Board said the USS Greenville spotted a Japanese fishing boat 71 minutes before ramming and sinking it. but a crew member on the submarine stopped plotting its position before the accident. He said civilian guests distracted him. And this evening, former President Clinton acknowledged his brother-in-law, Hugh Rodham, was paid for lobbying to have a businessman pardoned for a fraud conviction and a drug dealer released from prison. Mr. Clinton issued a statement saying he had just learned of the payments and was deeply disturbed. He said he asked Rodham to return the money. And before we go, a correction from last night. I said the late Stanley Kramer had directed High Noon, among many other films. That was wrong. He produced that movie. Fred Zinnemann was the director. We'll see you online and again here tomorrow evening. I'm Jim Lara. Thank you and good night.
Suppose there was a pill to help prevent heart disease and premature aging. There already is. Natural vitamin E. Who supplies it to the world?
Helping serious investors relax, knowing their investments are truly diversified. See how we earn it. Solomon Smith Barney.
This program was also made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to PBS stations from viewers like you. Thank you. Video cassettes of the News Hour with Jim Lehrer are available from PBS Video. Call 1-800-328-PBS-1.
This is PBS.
Good evening, I'm Jim Lara. On the NewsHour tonight, Margaret Werner follows up on the FBI spy story. Susan Dentzer and Elizabeth Farnsworth look at the problems bringing AIDS drugs to the poor. Ray Suarez monitors the storm over the rap star called Eminem. And essayist Roger Rosenblatt notes the passing of two special women. It all follows a summary of the news this Wednesday.
Imagine a system that produces and distributes food and helps improve nutrition and health here and abroad. Who is building such a global network?
This program was also made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to PBS stations from viewers like you. Thank you.
There was word today that the crew of the USS Greenville spotted a Japanese fishing boat 71 minutes before ramming and sinking it. The National Transportation Safety Board reported that finding, but a spokesman said a crew member on the American submarine stopped plotting its position less than an hour before the collision February 9th. He said the crewman told investigators civilian guests had distracted him.
The fire control technician of the watch told us that he ceased one of his tasks, updating the CEP, as it's called, which is the contact evaluation plot, which is a manual plot of each contact's bearing and the ship's own course over time, that he ceased one of his tasks, this updating the CEP, because of the number of civilians present.
The safety board official would not say if the halt in the plotting of the submarine's position was in fact a factor in the accident. A spokesman for the Navy said whether civilians distracted the crew will be a matter for a court of inquiry. It's now set to convene on Monday. Also today, U.S. Ambassador Thomas Foley offered personal apologies to the Emperor and Empress of Japan for the accident. He did so at a meeting with them in Tokyo. 9 people from the Japanese boat are missing and presumed dead. The U.S. Supreme Court today limited the scope of the Americans with Disabilities Act. In a 5-4 decision, it said state government workers cannot sue for monetary damages under the 1990 federal law. The majority said the 11th Amendment to the Constitution gives the states immunity from such federal lawsuits. President Bush today proposed an extra $1.6 billion for elementary and secondary education. It's within his plan to increase next year's Education Department budget by 11%, more than any other cabinet agency. And he called again for testing to make sure students learn the basics. He spoke at a school near Knoxville, Tennessee.
I think it's so important for us to prioritize public education. At the same time, we prioritize making it a priority of making sure our money is spent well.